Okay, well, thank you for joining me again, Father. How are you doing?
Thanks to God, I am well. Good to be with you again. I hope you're all well as well.
Yes, doing well. So tonight we have a different topic. We'll be reviewing. There's a video called "When the Orthodox Believed in Papal Authority" with Michael Lofton, and this was on the Matt Frad channel. So we can just jump into it as soon as you're ready here.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. Let me get it pulled up here.
Major schism that rocked the boat after the Council of Chalcedon. So we're talking, 5th and 6th century here. And some of the Eastern bishops, including the Bishop of Constantinople, went astray in some Christological issues related to Chalcedon. And long story short, in order for these Eastern bishops, including the Bishop of Constantinople, to be reconciled to the Orthodox faith in the Catholic Church, they had to sign Pope Hormisdas' formula. And in this formula, he's teaching the papal claims, that is, papal supremacy.
What year is this, roughly?
So this is going to be in the 500s. I'm trying to think the exact year.
That's fine. Yeah.
Is it 515?
All right, Father, did you just want to give a little background to what he's talking about here?
Yes, well, I don't know a lot about this particular historical time, but this is after the Council of Chalcedon and continuing issues and problems going with it. And this is leading up towards the Fifth Ecumenical Council. And so due to certain issues, I think heading towards sort of monotheism or some forms of that, there were certain schisms in the East, and the Pope decided to create this formula as a sort of way of defining the position of what it accepts as the correct the faith of the church. And so they expected the bishops around the world to sign on to this so that they will all agree of what the faith, and he was going to say only accept those who had agreed with this formula as being in the communion with the papacy, with the Pope of Rome.
Okay. Did you want me to pull that out now so we can read over it?
Let's keep going a little bit more on the video for now.
Okay.
What's the council?
Well, this is after Chalcedon.
Neil can look it up.
Yeah, this is after Chalcedon.
Okay.
I want to say Hormisdas is.
How do you spell that?
Hormis. Yeah. I can spell things when I write them out. It's hard for me to.
I'm the same.
But I think it's 515, somewhere around there. Over 250 bishops signed it.
And the
these
papal
are
claims
bishops.
are quite explicit back then.
And the papal claims are there. And that's why you'll find Protestant historians and even Orthodox historians who recognize, yes, the papal claims that you find later on expressed in Vatican I are being expressed in the formula for Hormisdas. They have their ways to try to respond to that, but it's generally conceded, yes, you do have over 250 bishops of the East signing off on the formula of Hormisdas. So that's just one example. Another example is probably a more important one is you have some of these papal claims being made at the ecumenical councils that the Eastern Orthodox themselves accept. So, for example, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, it's dealing with the whole issue of monothelitism versus diothelitism. So it's this debate between, does Jesus have one or...
Okay, no, you want me to stop it around this point?
Yeah, that'll be fine. Yes, I suppose what we should do then is just to go through the formula or parts of a formula. I think you've got the text. there and see
let me
what
pull
these
that through.
claims are and discuss what they mean.
Right. Okay. Sorry about that. 1 second. Okay. Okay. So you can see it now?
Yep, I can see that.
Okay, so we'll just read through it here. It says, the first condition of salvation is to keep the norm of the true faith and in no way to deviate from the established doctrine of the fathers. For it is impossible that the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, who said, Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, should not be verified. And their truth has been proved by the course of history. For in the Apostolic See, the Catholic religion has always been kept unsullied. From this hope and faith, we by no means desired to be separated. In following the doctrine of the fathers, we declare anathema all heresies, and especially the heretic Nestorius, former bishop of Constantinople, who was condemned by the Council of Ephesus by Blessed Celestine, Bishop of Rome, and by the Venerable Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria. We likewise condemn and declare to be anathema Eutyches and Dioscorus of Alexandria, who were condemned in the Holy Council of Chalcedon, which we follow and endorse. This council followed the Holy Council of Nicaea and preached the apostolic faith, and we condemn the assassin Timothy, surnamed Arurus the cat, and also Peter Mongos of Alexandria, his disciple and follower in everything. We also declare anathema their helper and follower, Acacius of Constantinople, a bishop once condemned by the Apostolic See, and all those who remain in contact in company with them. Because this Acacius joined himself to their communion, he deserved to receive a judgment of condemnation similar to theirs. Furthermore, we condemn Peter the Fuller of Antioch and all his followers together with the followers of all those mentioned above. Following, as we have said before, the Apostolic See in all things and proclaiming all its decisions, we endorse and approve all the letters which Pope St. Leo wrote concerning the Christian religion. And so I hope I may deserve to be associated with you in the one communion with the Apostolic See proclaims, which the Apostolic See proclaims, in which the whole true and perfect security of the Christian religion resides. I promise that from now on, those who are separated from the communion of the Catholic Church, that is, those who are not in agreement with the Apostolic See, will not have their names read during the sacred mysteries. But if I attempt even the least deviation from my profession, I admit that, according to my own declaration, I am an accomplice to those whom I have condemned. I have signed this, my profession, with my own hand, and I have directed it to you, Hormisdas, the Holy and Venerable Pope of Rome.
Right, yes. Well, first thing I can say, I'm not seeing in here some of the specific things of Vatican I which are claimed to be the papal issues, and what is the papal issues of which the Orthodox, for example, have a problem. And so they seem to talk about some sort of papal supremacy as if that is the problem, without defining what exactly they meant by that. It's not the idea of papal supremacy per se as a title. It is all the particular things that may mean. Now, if you could scroll back up to the top of that, please.
Yes. 1 second. Okay.
It's interesting here. There is an argument by many about what it means by this rock in Peter, and whether it's about the faith or whether it's about Peter as the person. Personally, I think it can mean both. But in this particular context, he is in the context of the faith. He's talking about the true faith and no way deviate from the established doctrine of the fathers. Then he speaks about Peter as a rock, and then he goes on, their truth is proved to the course of history, and has always been kept unsullied. So he's actually here speaking of the rock as the faith. That's what the context does. So this is not the normal thing about Peter as the person of the rock in this case. He is referring to the faith, because it definitely is a context of the faith being kept unsullied. The rest of this is just simply condemning everybody condemned at Chalcedon, which is Rome is very strong in following Chalcedon. Obviously, Pope Leo provided the core document for Chalcedon, so they were very strong in pursuing that. And there was still quite a lot of, and still is for a while in the East, attempts to return to some sort of monophysite position of some form, or what they call a miaphysite position. So that was a continuing struggle. And he's just anathematizing all those who are seeking to go back to that. And they were just enforcing his perspective of Chalcedon, and Rome holds on to that. Now, it is historically true to a certain degree that the See of Rome, until that time, had kept the Christian faith unsullied, though not in everything. Its opinions on certain matters of reception of baptismal converts, whether they're baptized or laying of hands, some of its positions vis-a-vis the liturgical norms, some of its positions on other matters were not accepted in general by all the churches in the East, and some of the churches in the East would find the positions of the Church of Rome problematic. But at this stage, these issues are within the sort of the general broader scheme of the economy of the church. And so, yes, pretty right that up to that stage, there was no major heresy, or there's little ones like Novatians that came along, but they sort of formed a subgroup within Rome. But the main Sees of Rome had kept the faith unsullied. Yes, that is historically true. And that's no problem. We don't necessarily disagree with that. The question is whether they always remain without heresy. That is what the question is. And Orthodox perspective would be, no, they haven't, because they started preaching heresy. So clearly that is not the case, even if they had kept it unsullied to that. We definitely know by the Sixth Ecumenical Council, which we'll deal later, that Honorius was condemned as a heretic. So that doesn't mean every pope is impossible to be a heretic. Some were, or at least one was condemned as a heretic. But even if the Apostolic See had been kept unsullied, this is not a problem for Orthodox, because we do believe it is a Petrine See, that the Petrine See is important to the unity of the churches, as a central see. The See of Constantinople claims exactly the same things now. And if it's going to have such a role, it has to have a certain stability. It can't be fickle, going back and forth between heresies. And the See of Constantinople, the stage wasn't necessary to be kept as stable as the See of Rome. So it doesn't matter if there were a few more heretics floating around in Constantinople, Alexandria, or Antioch, as long as someone stayed still. And Rome generally was preserved by God to be more faithful overall, as I say, not in every detail, but in the general faith through this time. So, but that didn't mean it was guaranteed to be perfected forever in this means. And we must remember Alexandria and Antioch, according to St. Gregory the Great, the Pope of Rome, are also for one Petrine See with Rome. And this is affirmed by the Council of Nicaea, which speaks of Alexandria and Antioch in terms of Rome, and has a separate canon for something like Jerusalem. And these are because they are the Petrine See in 3 bishops. And then Constantinople is equal of Rome, as Chalcedon and First Council of Constantinople affirm, as also affirmed by the Empire and Justinian. And it's being equal, carries all the Petrine privileges of old Rome, and therefore a certain sense of stability in Petrine status, even though it is not strictly an apostolical Petrine see in its own foundation, except the sort of a claim to St. Andrew, which I find unnecessary. So these sees are also have a certain level of apostolic, they're apostolic sees. Alexandria and Antioch are Petrine sees. So yes, Rome is talking about itself, can talk about itself as the apostolic see, but the problem is that we mustn't think of it exclusively for the see of old Rome or the elder Rome. This was shared by the other sees. And there is no guarantee that any particular patriarch or bishop would remain without being a heretic. What was more important, that the see itself would remain stable. That, in other words, they wouldn't have sort of a run of more than 2 or 3 heretical bishops before an Orthodox bishop took his place. And if we look at the see of Constantinople, since 9th century, if earlier, since about this time even, since after the iconoclasm has basically been maintained a solid orthodoxy. There is only a couple of exceptions. Cyril Lucatus, I can't remember his name, who went sort of a little bit Protestant and was condemned to a certain level for doing so, and there's maybe a couple others, but they've remained very orthodox in their faith for all these centuries, and so is Alexandria and Antioch. They've remained very stable in orthodoxy. They might have some issues of the present particular leaders or recent times, but overall, they do have been as solid as Rome ever was in the first millennium. So we can say that the evidence, as far as Orthodox are concerned, is they too are just as reliable, which is consistent with them being apostolic and Petrine sees. So the question is, though Rome speaks of itself in this manner, and being the first see, it has a certain point of union. And it's correct, we should all be in union with the first see of the church, like Constantinople, Alexandria, and all other things being equal, of course. And it's quite right that if we don't agree with the first see when it is being orthodox, that we shouldn't be part of the church, because it is a center of the communion of the churches. That's fine. That's just the status of a first see. It's nothing about papal supremacy, etc. So what do I mean? Now I'll just take a deviation from that, if you don't mind, to speak about the particular things that need to be seen in a council like this that support the papal claims. And what we need to see in the papal claims are probably 2 things. First instance, and then there's a conceptual model problem at the third. So the first thing is its claim for universal episcopal jurisdiction. There's nothing in this letter that says that. And what does universal episcopal jurisdiction mean? Well, what is a bishop? A bishop is a priest. And what role does he have in the priesthood? Well, as St. John Chrysostom speaks, he has effectively only one advantage over presbyters, which is ordination. He is a single source of ordination of the clergy in his diocese. There are 2 or 3 other points which a bishop has exclusive right to. One is consecrating altars. That's so that there is one source of all the altars in the church, just as to keep the unity of the churches, that they're all unified together. There's the presbyters break off and make separate churches in the same place. There's just one church in each place. So the bishop ordains all the clergy, so they all come from one source, and all the altars are consecrated by the bishop. And once they're consecrated by a bishop who's of that see, then they remain so forever. They don't lose their consecration. They don't have to have a new bishop come and do his consecration. Unlike modern distortion or things, anti-Mincians. Anti-Mincian is the altar. It's instead of a table. It's consecrated by a bishop. Once it's consecrated, it's good for life. But nowadays, they seem to all want to stamp their own personal mark. It's like distortion of what a bishop is in modern times. But the bishop does, and they used to make the myrrh for chrismation, again, to unify the chrism of all the priesthood. Nowadays, this is done by usual patriarchs and sent out, or even Constantinople and sent out. So that is just this evolution of it, but not a fundamental change. The other thing where a bishop has is this single consent. A presbyter cannot serve from a liturgy or the baptisms, etc., without the consent of the bishop. That doesn't mean it's run to him every time. There's going to be a standing consent. But if the bishop removes that consent, the presbyter can't do that. Or more specifically, what happens is it stops the presbyter acting completely independently of the bishop, setting himself up as if he is his own bishop in his own church, which would be to divide the one church in that place. So as to prevent a disunity of the church. That's what the bishop's role is. But he is a singular voice in the place. He's a singular person who does ordinations in the place, and he does it by himself. He ordains singularly. That means no other bishop comes in to join him. He does it by himself. He's a single point. He's a single voice of consent. And nobody else can have that. There's only one bishop per city, and nobody else can have authority over those churches other than the one bishop. And so when the papacy claims universal episcopal jurisdiction, what it's claiming is the ability to ordain clergy in any place. And you see this in the 11th century. This is actually the formal claim made in the Dictatus Papae of Gregory VII, that he can ordain a clergy in any place. There is no such claim of this in the Formula Hormisdas, but that is what it means by episcopal, and he can consecrate any altar or make myrrh for any of these places. And that when a priest wants to have consent for the liturgy, he can ask the bishop, pope. But that would mean there's two voices. And if the pope has that singular, the bishop is singular. It's very important the bishop is a singular voice. So if there's two that have a singular, then the bishop is no longer singular. He is no longer a bishop. His role as a bishop is a singularity among the priesthood. He ceases to be a bishop if there is someone else with the same authority. There's no meaning to them being a bishop then. And so this is why the idea of universal episcopal jurisdiction is rejected by Orthodox, because it denies fundamentally each bishop. Even though Rome claims that the bishops still have proper jurisdiction, in the fundamental sense of the singularity of the bishop for all ordination stuff, only he can do that, and no other bishop can interfere. This is completely in opposition to what the Orthodox believe. But it's that particular jurisdiction, and the Formula Hormisdas says nothing about that. It has no claim to that. The other thing which is a problem is the infallibility of a pope in ex cathedra, in his personal capacity in teaching. Again, God promises to keep the seas safe from, and you see this and perpetuate from heresy. It says nothing about the particular pope failing to teach the truth or write the truth in a particular context or acting as a function. It just means that the see itself will not go into a continuous line of heretics, unless, again, that is not an absolute sense too. If they start going into a particular thing that they cannot fall into heresy, and then they continue to hold it in obstinance, and God withdraws his help. He's there to help them, but never to override their freedom. So he helps to guide them, but never forces them to do that. So the idea of infallibility includes an idea that denies the actual freedom of the Pope to make a mistake. Even though we do believe that God helps priests and bishops to teach properly and to guide them when they're speaking and when they're preaching, but we do not guarantee that they can preach heresy if they're strong-minded to do so. So anyway, those are the 2 points we're looking for in these formulas. The episcopal or universal episcopal is simply not stated, and there is a sort of vague allusion to some form of infallibility, but it's not, again, stated. Apart from these, it doesn't matter what they say. Now, the other thing which is extremely important is a complete shift in the concept of the church. in the time of this, what we have is Rome is the first of many churches, as a federation of churches. It's the first of many. And as bishop, he's only the bishop of Rome. His episcopal jurisdiction as bishop only applies to the city of Rome. He has no right to act as a bishop anywhere outside Rome. Then he has a certain metropolitan jurisdiction where he calls to give us local synod, where they decide certain matters, hear appeals about priests doing bad things, deposing them, agreeing about particular common liturgical practices. But generally, they're a court that hears all the layman has been doing this or that and passing judgment, excommunications on the people, but particularly with the priesthood. Then he is I think, Exarch of Italy. He has an overview as a court of appeal for all the matters coming from the different synods throughout Italy. And then he's Patriarch of the West, in which case he has a certain overview of all the activities that happen in the churches in the West, hearing appeals, etc., from different exarchates, from different metropolises, ensuring that order has been achieved, writing letters, hearing trials, sometimes putting his nose in when you can see something egregious and say, hey, stop doing that, that's not right. So that's fine. That's what the Patriarch of Antioch's doing. That's what the Patriarch of Alexandria is doing. That's what the Patriarch of Constantinople or Russia is doing. That's all the patriarchal. And then Rome has a certain overview of all the churches, a certain universal overview. We can write letters to different churches and encourage them to keep the same practice and doctrine. And if necessary, if there's a complete failure, to try to sort something out, trying to help them to reestablish themselves and fix themselves up. That's all fine. That's all patriarch. It doesn't mean he's ever acting as a bishop in the local place, that he's ever taking on the role of a metropolitan in another metropolis, ordaining the bishops in that place. Though in an emergency, he might have to step in to try to help out or appoint somebody to try to do that who believes is orthodox when there's a whole lot of heresy and chaos. It's all right. That's part of the job. But he doesn't go in and start settling down. I will ordain all the bishops of each of these places as my now formal right. He respects that, and Leo the Great very much respects the rights of metropolitans to ordain the bishops of each region. That's their job. He respects the rights of appeals to be heard left, right, and centre. You see this definitely. The Eighth Ecumenical Council, as Orthodox call it, of 788-79, where the Pope recognises all the frockings and judgments of the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Patriarch of Constantinople recognises all of the frockings, etc., of Rome. And that means Rome doesn't consider itself above Constantinople in revoking its decisions. It accepts the decisions as made. It has no authority over Constantinople to overturn its appeal decisions. That doesn't mean it cannot help or put its nose into affairs in Constantinople if things turn upside down or someone appeals to it. But when there's an official appeal to Constantinople and that decision is made at Constantinople, Rome respects it. It does not seek to overturn it. That's what they claimed. Therefore, it's not claiming to have a universal authority over all these seats to hear all appeals, despite this. So that it doesn't have universal. But the point is that there are a whole lot of churches. Each have different layers, all grouped around metropolitans, exarchs, and patriarchs. And they have their jurisdictions. They have their formal things. Rome has a certain wider jurisdictions overview. It's fine. But what's happened is now a model where there's a sort of a singular organization with the Pope is like the first, like it's an extended diocese, as if one diocese, one bishop is now extended to cover the whole world. There's a singular diocese. He's bishop of all the world, of all places. And all the dioceses underneath that are just sort of little models, replications of this one super diocese. And he's like the bishop of all that. And the cardinal's like the priests of all the dioceses. But they, of course, they're not, but that's what they should be. But this is their model. So they're like one singular structure with him at the top of all. And rather than being one church among many in a sort of federalized situation. So this is, again, a concept that happens around the 11th, 12th century. And this is a whole rise of medical orders, etc., underneath the papacy that transcend diocesan boundaries. whereas before all monasteries were within a diocesan boundary. There's no right for an order to have a jurisdiction over the bishop. The monastery submits to the bishop. There's no one can interfere into that. No order can have an authority that digs into the monastic life underneath a bishop, overriding or going past them. That only happens when the papacy claims a sort of universal episcopal type of role. That's the only way they're allowed, because they're under him and therefore have that jurisdiction. So this is why these things are never known in the East. They were not known in the West until this form of papacy came into. So there's a whole different model here. But that, again, is not mentioned in this formula. So what they're trying to prove, okay, it's first, the only thing that's there is a sort of stability of orthodoxy there. And Orthodox will say, yeah, that's fine. There is a stability. We recognize that. We've continued that because you've deliberately, and after many years of us trying to tell you not to, stubbornly stuck into a pride of exclusivity of yourself as the only apostolic see, the only see of stability, the universal jurisdiction. And this pride is just cut yourself off from the church. There's nothing to do with the traditions of the church. You're inventing your own things, and you're carrying on your pride and exclusively taking these claims to yourself, and God just cut you off. It's had enough of you. That sort of arrogance. There's no place in the church. They've lost all humility. So that's our point. Is God provides the stability, but when it gets into a point of arrogance and pride and exclusivity, he just takes his hand away and says that's enough. He doesn't deny our humanity and our freedom. He works with it, not controlling it.
Right. And I think it's good to point out that traditionally, the majority view of the fathers concerning the rock of Peter, that was referring to the faith. I mean, that was not. A
number of them do speak about Peter, and it's fine. We can too. We can talk about the Petrine sees having a certain stability as a see. And that's important. We still have the see of Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch today. They have remained stable for 2,000 years. Their bits have broken off. Some of their patriarchs have broken off, and we've had sort of broken branches of some of these sees. But there's still been a continuing Orthodox presence in these sees, even though if you get maybe one or two heretics, then the Orthodox one comes back in. And so the see is overall has stayed Orthodox. That's fine. This is part of the Petrine promises, because these are important sees for the communion of the church to help the church be united. If they all kept falling in and out, we would have chaos in the structure of the church, because everyone would go, oh, I'm Orthodox, or we have a correct communion, no, we have a correct communion. This is what happens with the old calendarists. They start breaking off because everyone is trying to argue, well, we've got it right. No, you haven't got it quite right. Oh, you did this wrong. Therefore, you're cut off from the church. Now we're the only church. There's no grace. No, this becomes a perpetual nonsense if we just collapse it to just simply the faith. No, we need a stability of the hierarchical institutions as well. And so Rome is right to sort of see that side of Rome as well. That's fine. We expect to see that in the fathers. It's when it started to just think about it exclusively for itself, and to the exclusion of recognize the Petrine see of Alexandria as a Petrine see, and of Antioch, and also Constantinople is equal to it. And because Constantinople is equal to it, the Orthodox Church has lost nothing from Rome's stability, and it was allowed to fall because the stability is maintained perfectly adequately. Everything that Rome provided to the churches continued with Constantinople. There's nothing we lost by the Orthodox Church. Well, I should say the Catholic Church. We are the Catholic Church. We haven't lost anything moving away of Rome. Rome continues in its full effect with Constantinople. And so Rome has just gone off itself because it acted in an exclusive way. It's distorted its position there. But we expect this. It's fine. We can have a stability. They can talk about it for Peter, etc. And God, in a sense, has kept that promise to them. They still have a bishop to this day. They haven't disappeared and been swamped by barbarians or the whole city wiped out and the bishop scattered highway and handsome sort of thing. They had their Avignon time when they were sort of cast off into France for a while. So God, in a sense, has even preserved them despite their heresies. Nevertheless, they went too far in that preservation side, and it's not an absolute sense. There is God helps, but it doesn't protect each and every patriarch personally from falling into heresy. It just means that God will raise up an Orthodox patriarch to replace maybe one or two or three heretics in the road, so that the see returns back to its orthodoxy and its stability.
Yeah, and I think they're using that term unsullible, or is it the faith has been kept unsullible? And I think they're conflating that with the dogma, the Vatican I dogma of papal infallibility with that.
Yes. That God kept the faith unsullible, doesn't necessarily, and they're equating that with the Bishop of Rome, not the Apostolic See, which is not just the Bishop of Rome. That's all about presbyterism there. It's a see keeping it as a whole. The actual formal doctrines of the See of Rome are kept unsullied. And that's why, despite a lot of problems of the East, it's not until they started officially proclaiming the corrupted, the Filioque creed, the false creed, in their liturgies, did they officially lose that stability. It's only then that's why the schism really took place straight after they did that. Before that, they didn't actually preach and stuff. They were safe from falling into heresy. They didn't read the creed, and they didn't preach during the service. So they couldn't do anything heretical as long as they just kept the services going. The see was going to be safe forever because they wouldn't get to the stage of making a mistake. The old bishop might write something stupid and be found a heretic later, but the see itself was secure in its continued maintenance of liturgy. But no, once they started introducing the corrupted creed and proclaiming that publicly, then yes, that stability was gone because they no longer proclaimed the Orthodox faith, the Apostolic faith. They proclaimed something else, and therefore lost the stability.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall they're, like you were saying, they're absolutizing this honorific and hyperbolic language that's used.
Well, look, I'll be careful about trying to take the line of honorific and hyperbolic language. The language is certainly true. That it's not just hyperbolic. There's a real meaning to the language. There's a real point. But they're absolutizing the language beyond what it is. So when we sometimes talk about these things, so I'll just give an example. We can talk about the whole crowd roared. Does that mean every single person in the crowd roared? No. It just means that so many of the crowd roared that it's impossible to start pointing out anyone who didn't. There undoubtedly are people who are not roaring, but there's so much overwhelming majority of them doing it. We can speak legitimate. The whole crowd roared, and again, so when we can speak legitimately of the Council of Nicaea for having a unanimous consent. Yet 2 or 3 bishops didn't agree and were excommunicated, etc. It's not trying to be an absolutist detail thing. It is trying to get the real feel as unanimity, but it allows the old exception. And again, the continuation of the faith of Rome up to there allowed a couple of bishops to go heretical, but it doesn't matter because the whole flow is being stable and kept stable and in a sort of very full way. So words are not just simply honorific or a flowery language. They are real meaning, but we mustn't take them in an absolute rigorous way and in the sense that there's no exceptions to it. No, we must read them with a little bit of looseness, but not too loose to lose any meaning at all. So we've just got to read them with actual meaning, but just not too absolutely rigorously.
Yeah, because I've heard that the same language is used, of emperors at times.
Yes, and there's a real belief that the empire was going to be eternal and last to end time. That is a real belief. And that's John Chrysostom basically teaches that. So there is a very strong sense of that. And even the fathers speak about it. But it wasn't to be taken in an absolute or narrow sense. Now, we can actually argue that perhaps the empire hasn't ceased, at least in a functional, symbolic manner, but it is no longer continuing in that particular form which was there, which is what they were expecting it to do. But nevertheless, there's a certain truth that has continued. So as I said, these truths, etc. And as I said, the promise to Rome is continuing in Constantinople. It is New Rome. It is continuing. The promises that they're talking about are in fact continuing. The stability is in fact continuing. So we have problems now of the ecumenical patriarch, but overall it's continuing. So it just thinking of things in a narrow, limited sense, and only thinking in that. But we mustn't move to the other extent of just flowery language, etc. No, there's some real truths to this. And so we've got to be careful not to jump from one extreme to the other. It's just an honor. No, it's not. He has a real authority, a very certain authority. It's not just a title honor. There's a real authority there. But it's what do we mean, the exact limits of authority, and not jumping to excesses of it's absolute, dining bishops, all that, never fails and to make a wrong. He never makes a wrong decision. He never fails in his authority. And this is an absolutization, which is the problem. But it doesn't mean that there isn't a certain stability and correctness that and long-term sense, which we are to hold on to.
Yes. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but I've heard from other sources that as far as this formula of Hormisdas, that only the Patriarch of Constantinople signed off on this one, and that there was other ones that were produced for the other patriarchs, and the wording is different in those ones.
Yeah, it could be. There's often we see that some of the wording you see in the Latin text is different from what's in the Greek text. But anyway, I don't mind that this text can be said to be fine as it is. And I think there's that classic saying when the Patriarch of Constantinople signs off on it, says, See of Rome and Constantinople are one see, which is correct. Yeah. They are one see. They are one see of Rome in two places. Just as Alexandria, Antioch, Rome are one Petrine see and three bishops, as St. Gregory the Great teaches. This is a teaching of the Pope when he wrote an official letter to the Dioscorus of Alexandria in his capacity as Pope. The same level of teaching authority as expected from Honorius when he was writing his letters before which he was condemned to heresy. Roman Catholics are now very quick to sweep this under. It doesn't blah 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 blah, trying to hide it. No, this is a teaching of Rome, and that's basically consistent with the ecumenical councils, First Ecumenical Council, and the order of the churches. That's fine. That's the tradition of the East. They're distorting things to a sort of collapse into the singularity of an exclusive singularity of the See of Rome. So anyway, yes, I think I got around that.
Right. All right. Let me get back to the video. I'll play it for a couple minutes here.
Yes, there's something around 8 minutes later on. I think I put some other time stuff for you.
Well, I think you have something marked at around the 5-minute mark. I'll stop there. Okay.
One or two wills.
I found a Pope Hormisdas.
Yeah, Pope Hormisdas, and it's formula or libelli of Hormisdas. So
when did he live there? That's probably there.
I think it was 515.
Wow,
is when the document was.
Yeah.
I should know. I was just looking at it in Denzinger.
I'm really impressed that you even knew the century.
I was just looking.
I don't even know the dates of my kids' birthdays. So.
Well, my
he
kids
died on 514.
Claims.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Papal supremacy and papal infallibility in it.
Okay.
So here you have the Council Fathers, claiming this thing is divinely inspired. They completely accepted the letter that was, again, read out loud and has the papal claims. Some Orthodox might respond, okay, well, if that's your interpretation, if they're accepting papal infallibility, why did they then condemn Honorius? We can get into that question. How did they condemn Honorius just a few sessions after affirming allegedly papal infallibility, and how does Honorius fare with papal infallibility? We can get into all that, but working through that issue, I still realize this was in favor of Catholicism.
Okay, right here he's talking about the letter of Pope Agatho.
Yes.
I know if you had any background on that.
No more particular background on that than what he's mentioned. It was just a letter sent to the Sixth Ecumenical Council from Pope Agatho. Now, actually, I can give a little bit of background in the sense that at the Council of Jerusalem, Peter became sort of the first one who's recorded giving a speech, and he was the first of the apostles. And then afterwards, Paul and Barnabas and the others spoke about things. So there is a certain privilege of the first see to present the first declaration of statement of faith at an ecumenical council. And so you get the letter of Celestis at Ephesus. You've got, now you don't get this at the first ecumenical council, but you at the third and nor at the second, but the second you don't have any representatives from Rome there. They were going to have a separate Western council, which was going to be part of the sort of a combined second ecumenical council, but they never got around to actually holding the Western part. So the Eastern part becomes the ecumenical council in its own right. They were all teaching the same thing, the same faith. And then at Chalcedon, you get the letter of Pope Leo, becomes the prominent letter. At the Fifth Ecumenical Council, you get Vigulus there, but he doesn't sort of attend. And I don't think he writes something. He does write something. I'm not sure if it's heard at the council or read at the council or not. I can't remember. But it's certainly the council doesn't record his letter as being the sort of document of faith. Then at the Sixth Ecumenical Council, again, Agatho sets the first letter. And again, when the Pope is writing his letter in faith, his letter often is inspired, is guided by the Holy Spirit, is guided by Peter. And as long as he's writing according to the faith, which when you're getting a ecumenical council, generally they are, it's good. It stands as a testimony of the faith. It stands as something that we could be said to be inspired. It is found as Peter has spoken. That's fine. That's just what happens at ecumenical councils in the first voice. So we're not surprised to see these letters. So this letter is Pope Agatho's letter to the council about the matters of faith. And in it, he does make certain claims that are of the place of Apostolic See as a center of and stability, the mother of the empire. Again, there's a sort of a little bit of conflation between Apostolic See and the Church as a whole. But okay, some of the Apostolic See, the See of Rome, is grounded in the capital of the empire and has a profound effect on the relationship to emperors, etc. It's the first bishop to whom the emperors talk to, and who the government of the empire speaks to. So it has a profound effect on the whole life of the empire. In practice, this is much more taken over by the Patriarch of Constantinople, moving on from about the 4th century. He's the one that's really at the heart of the imperial practice and laws and engagement with Christianity and the faith. But early on, yes, the See of Rome has an important function in that. So that's one of the things he speaks about. Again, the stability. Again, as the first see of a church, as long as he's Orthodox, we have to be in communion with them. That makes sense. If we're not in communion with the first see of the church, the center of unity, then what are you doing? You're breaking off from the seas. Unless, of course, you can show it to be heretical, which is not. It's going to be hard work. God does help try to preserve these seas, as I said before. That's again, it's very similar to the form of Hormisdas. There's nothing in it again which says I can have a right to ordain bishops, presbyters and deacons and churches in any place. As the Pope of Rome, I'm an infallible voice and I speak ex cathedra, and this is true to that, and all bishops will be infallible and fail to speak heresy until the end of time. Nothing like that. Nothing I can consecrate all altars across the world. Nothing like I ordain all bishops across the world. No. These are the types of claims that we reject. Not that he's first. Not that he has the importance of a central see, of the stability of a central see. These things, of course, we accept, because if we don't, We all have our own problems of stability. And some of the times in the Orthodox, when they throw these things out, actually throwing out the tradition and getting confused. Again, it's a lot. People taking things to extremes, trying to read too much into it. He sees these things, oh, it's Vatican. No, it doesn't. And it only does that too if you assume that there's some sort of superstructure, let's say one huge diocese with the popes at the head of that. Then of course you need to have some sort of infallibility of the individual pope. But if it's just one see among many, the fact that one or two goes doesn't change the orthodoxy of all the other sees there. They can continue without him for a little while and fine. But for a little while, he needs to be there in the longer term picture. So one or two heretics, one later, okay, it's not a problem. It doesn't disturb the stability of the see overall. It's only once it gets officially starts proclaiming a false creed, officially starts ordaining bishops according to a false creed, false canons, making new ecumenical councils of itself, claiming this things of faith, then it's in trouble. If it just keeps quiet and just gets on with its business, it's not likely to get in any trouble at all, which is what Rome did for 1,000 years until it started messing around with its creeds and let the Franks get too much control.
Yeah, and we can't read what Pope Agatho said in such an absolute sense. I mean, considering, we had a situation with Vigilius being condemned by the council, and then after this is when they condemned or they anathematized Pope Honorius. So why would the council? I mean, if they really had that in their mind of this, this papal indefectibility, a doctrine that modern Roman Catholics have, then why would they go on to anathematize the Pope? I mean, immediately after this letter.
Exactly. They weren't thinking about that at all. Yeah, but they were agreeing with us. This is fine. We can agree with this. We understand it in a certain way. We have it understand for certain limits. We don't read Vatican I back into this. We understand. We say, you can read more back into some of these things. Some of the statements can be read in more of a Vatican I way if you wish to read them like that. Sure, I'm not saying that it's impossible to read that into this. But we don't. We accept them as they state. We see things, but we read them with certain limits, certain qualifications, etc., which is fine. But they stand strong. So it's because you're trying to read something back into them, it gets a problem. And of course, people see that and then try to counter-react and say too much in the opposite direction, which is not helpful either.
Right. All right, let me get back to the video. So I'll probably play for a few more minutes.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing more and more instances where the East is signing off in some cases to the Catholic claims that would then find their expression ultimately in Vatican I. So papal supremacy and papal infallibility at Vatican I, they're there already in seed form in the first millennium, and some of the Eastern bishops are signing off. Now, I don't want to say that this was always the case. There were, I think, plenty in the East who dissented from the papal claims. I think there were also plenty in the East who dissented from the doctrine of the Trinity or the deity of Christ or that Jesus has two wills. There were plenty in the East who had doctrinally deficient views, including doctrinally or ecclesiologically deficient views. So just because you find some people who dissented from the papal.
I'm finding this as a little bit biased in him here, as if the Easterners were the ones that are always causing problems. There were problems in the West, Pelagius, etc. There were various heretical streams that happened in the West. So it's not just like Easterners were all heretical and the Westerners were all perfectly fine. No. So I think that there's a slight bias in what he's saying here, as if the Easterners are somehow caught with heretical bugs. And it does matter that the Easterners didn't accept these so-called papal claims. If these papal claims were the tradition of the church, grounded in the faith, you would see the Copts holding them. You would see or having to fight against them, or the Syriacs or the Church of the East. They did no such thing. They didn't think there was any necessity for these claims. So they're not the tradition. And the idea of seed form, etc., that can be conflated with what I said, as we understand them to be true, but with certain limitations. And that's he's describing as a seed form. No, it's actually a different type of doctrine because it has limits on it. It has specific boundaries to it. And when you start defining it in a other way, you're no longer talking about the same thing. And this is what's happening. So this is deceptive. A lot of the things he's saying there, the way he's sort of slurring the East, and he's sort of implying a sort of development of a legitimate development of doctrine. So I'm not seeing that's actually what you're doing here, taking the same evidence and twisting it to a sense that it makes it look like it's the development of a seed. When, as a matter of fact, this is a totally different doctrine.
Right.
Papacy doesn't necessarily mean that the papacy is wrong any more than just because you find people who are denying the deity of Christ. That somehow makes Jesus not divine. So again, you'll have people who will respond and they'll point to instances where some in the East did not accept the papal claims. I'm aware of that. But I'm seeing in the context of an ecumenical council, them accepting the papal claims. I'm also seeing them accepting the papal claims in a very, very crucial context of coming back into Orthodoxy with the formula of Hormisdas. And by the way, in the formula, there's a very curious phrase because it effectively notes communion with the Holy See is communion with the Catholic Church. It identifies those two things. So they're identifiable. In other words,
I mean, I know we discussed this earlier, but was there anything else you had to say on that?
Well, since we're there, again, the first see of a church, the center of communion of a church is, yes, generally, in principle, if you are in communion with the first see of the churches, the center for communion of the churches, you're in communion with the church as a whole. Yes, that in itself is normal, standard. What else can you say? That makes sense. It doesn't mean it has some sort of, it becomes a super diocese across all the globe with its bishop being the bishop of all the world. No, this is not, doesn't what mean at all. As a matter of fact, it tends to support that it's a see in its own self, with its own diocese, with its own limited territory of one city. That is the first among many sees, and they come into communion with it as a see. But that, again, also doesn't mean the absolute sense that the bishop will not be heretical, or that particular singular manifestation of the Petrine See or the See of Rome will itself remain forever. Even the See of Rome remains, as I said, in Constantinople it can remain. Even the Petrine See remains in Alexandria and Antioch. The promises of these things are still true. So it's all about whether it makes that claim. The focus at the time is indeed Rome, and there's a certain truth to that. But it doesn't mean it's an absolute sense that it's always just going to that see and all that sense of Rome and that sense of Patron See that is going to be forever holding on to it. And so there is a truth to it, but you can go too far.
Yeah, and it's really nothing different from what probably the Patriarch of Constantinople would say today, more in recent times. I mean, you have to be in communion with the church, with the first see of the church.
Yeah, it's exactly.
That's all it means.
It makes sense. It doesn't mean and we mustn't take that in absolute sense. If he falls into heresy, we go, whoa. But in all normal conditions, yes, that is correct. As long as he stays faithful to the faith, yeah, we must stay in communion with him, yes.
Yep.
Whereas if you're not in communion with the Holy See, that is Rome, you're not in communion with Catholic Church. And again, they're signing off on this.
And this was to the point of what kind of church has Christ established? Maybe he doesn't want us to be all that clear on every particular doctrine, but the examples you're giving us is in history.
But the examples I'm saying, and I think this is a point that Eric Ibarra has made very well. And in fact, a lot of his content really helped me work through some of these things. He kind of pushed me in that way, but I was just hearing them out. I'm hearing
He's
Orthodox.
such a humble guy.
Yeah, very
If I was
knowledgeable.
as intelligent as him, no way. I'd be a
Very
convert.
knowledgeable.
No
and
way.
so I was hearing him out, hearing the Orthodox out, looking into issues myself, considering what everyone has to say. But he would make some really good points. And one of the observations he's brought up, and I'll just simply repeat it, is that if Catholicism isn't true and the papacy isn't true, what does that do then to Eastern Orthodoxy whenever you have Orthodoxy saying that it upholds these ecumenical councils, and then in the acts of the ecumenical councils, you have the papal claims? What does that do to Eastern Orthodoxy? I mean, another example is the Council of Ephesus, the Third Ecumenical Council. You have the legate who is representing the Pope, because the Pope's not present at the Ecumenical Council in Ephesus. This is 431. You have the...
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're running out of time, unfortunately, and I just thought this is the last point I was going to talk about. Firstly, I don't see that the papal claims have been made in any of these councils. So I think that point has not been established. All he's established is that there is a priority of a church. You see, and it has, of Rome, and as a church with certain authority, and that certain claims of stability, and a certain sense as a first see that we are in communion with it. Fine, we Orthodox accept that, and having accepting all those statements, we haven't. The problem he's talking about pulling bits and pieces out is not true. Now, by the way, Orthodox don't pull bits and pieces out, or that we take the Ecumenical Council as a whole. Having said that, we do distinguish between the acts or the things that are said and the thing of a record of what's done from the actual decree of the council. The decree is inspired by the Holy Spirit. The canons are inspired by the Holy Spirit. These things are unchangeable and stable. They are the word of God. They are testimonies of God by the Holy Spirit. They stand alongside the scriptures. And we follow these things with great care. But the acts in themselves, though we have a great respect for them, and generally we hold them true, they are not themselves the decree. They're not the thing that is inspired in itself. And so it's similar to some stories of the apostles of John and the story of their martyrdom. They're not part of the gospel. They're not part of the acts. We don't hold them as scripture. But we generally believe them and follow them and accept them as true. But we don't in an absolute sense. So the same as the acts, where we have a high opinion of them because they express the voices and opinions and actions of the saints who are there. They're not themselves over these definitions. So make that distinction. But otherwise, Orthodox, we accept it. We accept everything that is in there. And the letter of Agatho is sort of an accepted and received an official document which we need to believe and accept. Fine, we accept it. We don't push them away. It's just a matter of how we interpret the information in there, how we read it, how we qualify it to make it, in a sense, consistent with everything else which we know about the church. And don't read, as Protestants do, you take, or certain groups do, you take one thing and read it too much and try to force everything into it. We read these things in the consistency of all the other doctrines of the church. As I said about the bishop, there can't be a universal bishop because that denies all other bishops, because there's only one bishop in each place, and it can only be one bishop because being a bishop is precisely to be one, to be a one alone among the presbytery. You cannot have more than bishop by definition. So we can't have a universal bishop without denying the actual bishops. And so this is just theology, ecclesiology. So there is no need to go to a paper as a distortion of this. It's not being matched in everything. It's not being balanced with things. And this is what we see. So yeah, we don't pull bits and pieces out and take a little bit of this and refuse that. We accept the Ecumenical Council's decrees and the canons in the total and follow them. As a matter of fact, from my experience, the Orthodox Church is the only one that does that. Roman Catholicism have abandoned that a long, long time ago. They don't hold the canons that Leo the Great, the Pope of Rome, says are those of God, and we must follow them, the canons of Nicaea, until the end of time for all people. They don't believe that in Roman Catholicism. Now, they believe that these are just practical things which can be changed by each pope or from time to time. Like the canon of Nicaea, you must not kneel on Sunday. they kneel by default on Sunday, especially at the more traditional masses. As a matter of fact, the so-called New Order is less doing that and more obedient to the canon than their so-called traditionalists, who will kneel down for huge chunks of the service, not just one moment or something like that, an exceptional moment, but for the whole service, and influence Easterners to do the same thing. No, we don't kneel on Sunday. That's what the Council of Nicaea, which is the canon which Leo the Great says must stay firm until the end of time for all peoples, and it is a uniform practice across all the churches. They don't believe that anymore, so they can't talk about whether accepting the canon, the councils and everything that it says. They don't do that. So I find that a little hypocritical, that type of argument. Orthodox do. We do follow that, not necessarily in the way that any particular person may think that they do so, or any particular narrow interpretation. And a lot of people, Orthodox scholars, might say, well, the canons contradict themselves. No, they don't. If you read them carefully, you balance them out, understand them, and relate them together, they all speak absolutely consistently. You've got to read them together like that. And that takes a little skill. It takes a broader sense of tradition. And it takes a matter of faith that this is what this is. So I think he's overstated his argument. He hasn't developed any depth to the argument. He hasn't gone through, and this is what I find mostly Roman Catholic apologists. They fail to mention the points that are necessary. There's evidence that the Bishop of Rome, by normality, and not an exception, by the normal process, has a right to ordain presbyters and deacons and readers and subdeacons in any diocese he wishes, with no needing to ask any permission. He just rolled in there. That this is a common practice, commonly understood across the time. We don't see any evidence of this, none at all. You get the occasional thing where he's appointing a bishop somewhere outside, usurping the right potentially of a metropolitan, that at most, or acting in Constantinople way, which could be said to infringe the autocephalous nature of. These are not so important. These are not ones that are about the tradition, that are ways of things. Now, metropolitans is, and I don't really, Leo the Great is very strong to defend the metropolitan's rights, and I don't see the Pope ever really interfering at that level. But sometimes a little Constantinople, but that's okay. There's some scope for that in his appeal function. Of course, he can overextend himself. The Constantinople overextends itself. It interferes with things. And we don't suddenly say, oh, it's got papal supremacy in Constantinople. No, it just overextends itself. So the same happened in Rome in the past, as it does in Constantinople now. That's fine. It's all part of humanity, expressing itself in the church. But we don't see those things there. We don't see any specific claim for absolute infallibility until about the 11th century, when we do start seeing a different understanding of what the church is, a different understanding of what the papacy is. And it becomes... Though it's a development of a growing understanding, we see getting stronger and stronger from the 9th, 10th century, the papacy was in complete disarray. We don't even talk about how disgustingly immoral it was, and it was controlled by families and stuff. It is a bad century for the papacy. When the reformers come in who start to be good, that in the early 11th century, that's when they start bringing a lot of other ideas into their reforms, and that's where you get a new type of papacy comes into place, to which I think there is a fair consistency until today. Even today, though, there is a sort of a super globalization of the Pope, which was never even known in the 17th, 16th century. He was still really a far-off bishop among many who you just got a vague notion of permission for them to do things. And it's not this sort of global Holy Father type thing, which we get now, which is quite modern, really.
Yeah. So basically, we as Orthodox, we do accept what Pope Leo said, what Pope Hormisdas said, what Pope Agatho said, but we do not accept the Vatican I interpretation of what these popes have said.
Yes. Yes. And I don't see any reason why we can't. Now, having said that, some of these things are a little challenging to Orthodox position and stuff, and it would be nice if Rome was still in the church. But they're not in this. But the things that Rome has done that are contrary to tradition, how many things it's done contrary to tradition, it's quite clear that whatever it wants to claim about it being stable, in fact, it is not stable. Any historian would look at it and say it is not stable. As a matter of fact, their own teaching now is that they don't need to be stable. Their own practices have changed. Their own sense of the canons have changed. One pope contradicts another. There is no stability, and that's pure fact of looking at what's on there. That's why you get these groups running off about the Second Vatican Council and complaining about it. And there's massive problems. I agree with them. The problem is they should have stayed with Orthodoxy. It's too late when they're running off the set of vacantist type position now. But there's a reason for that. They lack stability. Most people accuse Orthodox of being stuck in the 6th century or something. And there's trying to move into modernism. That's because they are continuing the traditions of the apostles. Not perfectly. We've got many problems, but nevertheless, in principle, at least until the 1950s, 60s, sort of, they were known for doing that. And so that so-called slur on us is the very fact that we are keeping the traditions, and Rome certainly not. And we know we're keeping the traditions. We look at the Copts and the Syriacs. They're doing what we are doing, and we're doing what they're doing, and they are doing a much better job than Rome and all these things. So if we had Rome making its claims and they were as consistent with the traditions as Orthodoxy, apart from the papal claim, etc., okay, they had a case to be made, but the evidence otherwise, it doesn't support it. They're not keeping the traditions which they used to have in the 5th century, 7th century, 8th century. They're evolving and changing. So that itself, the historical evidence, shows that their interpretation must be wrong. And so we put it aside. Even though it looks very tempting, it looks like it could be true, and there's a certain appeal to it. And if you want to take the words very literally, yes, you can make an argument for it. But if we look at the big picture, we have to say, no, we can't do that. There is a truth to them, but if we take them this way, we'll end up in all sorts of self-contradictory positions.
Yeah, I think if anyone looks at the ecclesiology and the sacramentology of the first millennium, you're going to see that the Orthodox, are much more closer to that than what the Roman Catholics are today.
Yeah.
Okay. So with that, I know we're running out of time here, but
yes, you've got
it's getting late where you're at.
And it's midnight here, so my carriage is going to turn into a pumpkin. But it'd be nice if my pumpkin turned into a carriage.
All right, Father. Well, yeah, thanks again for joining me and having this discussion. So
you're welcome. It's a pleasure. Have a good evening. Enjoy your dinner, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yes, thank you again, Father. Have a good night.
Bye for now.